I want to tell you something I've said to hundreds of students over 20 years of teaching. Listen closely. Your English is better than you think it is. Now, I know what most people do with that sentence. They hear it, nod, feel briefly encouraged or good about themselves, and then go right back to waiting. Waiting to feel ready, waiting for their English to reach some imaginary high level before they try an opportunity again. That is the problem I want to talk to you about today. Not just this underestimation of your English, but what it costs you. And more importantly, what the right response to it actually looks like, because it's not what most people think. The right response is not to relax, is not to decide you've already arrived, is to step into the conversation imperfectly, bravely, and then keep pushing. Both of those things, not one or the other. So let's get into it. Let me describe something, and I want you to tell me honestly if this sounds familiar. You are in a situation where English is required, maybe a job interview, an international meeting, a networking event, a conversation with a native speaker. And before you open your mouth, that internal monologue starts. Oh, my English isn't good enough for this. What if I don't understand them? What if I say something wrong and embarrass myself? Maybe I should wait until my English is better. So, you hold back. You stay quiet. You let someone else take the conversation. You don't apply for that work opportunity. You wait. Here's what I want you to understand about that internal monologue. It is not an accurate report of your abilities. It is your brain under stress, measuring your English against an imaginary standard, and finding you lacking, not enough. In 20 years of teaching, I've sat across from students who apologized for their English before even saying a single sentence, and then they went on to communicate clearly, intelligently, and effectively for the next hour. I've watched learners turn down job opportunities because they felt their English wasn't ready, when in reality, their English was more than enough for the role. The gap isn't between their English and the requirement. The gap is between how they see their English and how it actually lands with other people. But here's what I'm going to do, and this is very important. I'm not going to use that gap as a reason to tell you to stop improving, because there is a second gap I need to talk about, and this one is also very dangerous. Quick word before I continue with the video. One of the most effective ways to close the perception gap is to get real practice in real conversational pressure. Not study, practice. The AI speaking coach inside the B2 Edge app puts you in the kinds of situations that trigger that internal monologue. Job interviews, professional meetings, everyday conversations, so you can discover that your English performs better than you actually feared. And so you can get precise feedback on where it still needs to grow. If you want to learn more about the app, link is in the description of the video. Now let's keep going. Here's the root of the perception problem. One sentence. You are measuring your English against the wrong benchmark. When most learners evaluate their own English, they compare themselves to native speakers, and then they measure the distance between where they are and that person, and they feel like they're failing. But here's the question nobody asks. Is that actually the relevant benchmark for your life? When you go into a job interview conducted in English, do they need you to sound like a native speaker? Or do they need you to communicate clearly, professionally, and confidently? When you are in an international meeting with colleagues from Germany, Japan, India, Brazil, who is the benchmark? The native speaker? Or the person who gets their point across, understands what's being asked, and contributes meaningfully to the conversation? Most professional English in the world today is spoken between non-native speakers. English is the global language of business, science, and diplomacy, and the vast majority of conversations happening in English right now involve people who learned it as a second language, people with accents, people who occasionally forget a word, people who are non-native speakers. I'm not a native speaker. And these people are doing business. They're closing deals, making money, leading teams, building careers. You don't need to sound like you grew up in London or New York specifically. You need to be understood. You need to be credible, and you need to be present in every conversation and interaction you have. If you can follow this video, if you've understood everything I've said so far, you are already operating at a level where trying for that opportunity, for that situation, actually makes sense. But here's where I'm going to push back on the "you're already good enough" narrative, because it's not so black and white. There is a version of this message that I see doing real damage to learners at B1, B2, and above. That's the complacency trap. There is a version of "your English is good enough" that becomes an excuse to stop growing. And I've seen it dozens of times. A learner reaches upper intermediate, a solid B2 level. They can communicate, they get through conversations, they feel comfortable. And then they stop pushing. Not dramatically, not consciously, they just settle. And the language stops growing with them. Here's the truth about language development at higher levels. At B1, the goal is survival. Communicate, get through it, don't shut down. Fluency is the priority. Getting the idea across is what matters. But as you move toward B2, C1, and eventually C2, the calculus changes. The environments you want to operate in, professional, academic, international, they start noticing accuracy as well. They notice register. They notice whether you chose the right word and not just a word. They notice whether your English sounds considered or careless. And the learner who stops pushing for accuracy at B2 is the learner who stays at B2 forever. Here's how I think about the balance. Listen very closely. Fluency and accuracy are not opposites. They are partners. And the ratio, especially at B2 and above, should be roughly 60% fluency to 40% accuracy. 60% fluency means you stay in the conversation. You don't freeze. You don't mentally edit every sentence before it comes out. You move, you communicate, you keep going. 40% accuracy means you pay attention to what you say. You notice when you said something incorrectly. You go back after the conversation and ask, why did I say that? What's the correct form? What word should I have used? And then you close the gap. The 60% gets you in the room. The 40% is what builds toward excellence in English. Over the years, I've had many students who fit a very specific pattern. I'm not going to use a name because honestly, this wasn't just one person. They come to class with solid English already. They understand complex topics. They can write clearly. They can follow conversations in films. By any objective measure, they are at a good intermediate level, sometimes even a solid B2 level already. But they still describe themselves as beginners. They say, my English is very basic, before a conversation that is anything but basic. And when I ask what they're working toward, the answer is usually, I'm waiting until I can really speak properly. Waiting. I had one student who spent 2 years waiting to take on an international project at her company. 2 years. Colleagues with weaker English were already doing it. When she finally said yes, when she finally walked into that room, she came back to me and told me, Thiago, it was actually fine. Why did I wait so long? That's the first half of the story. But here's the second half. And this one, I don't hear talked about enough. After that breakthrough, some learners do something counterproductive. They decide they've arrived. The fear disappears. And unfortunately, so does the drive. They start treating good enough to try as good enough, full stop, period. And the ones who do that, the ones who confuse the courage to start with the permission to coast, they are the ones who plateau, who stay at B2 for 5 years, who always feel like something is missing from their English but can never quite name what it is. What's missing now is the 40% accuracy I mentioned earlier. The part that never stopped asking, how can I be more precise in my communication? How can I be more accurate? How can I go from communicating to excelling in English? Let me leave you with this. Yes, your English is probably better than you think. And the real problem, is that you have been using that underestimation as a reason not to try that opportunity, not to try that promotion. So stop waiting. You're ready enough to be in the room. That's great. But look, here's a second truth, and it matters just as much. Being ready enough to try something is not the same as being finished. The learners who become truly excellent in English, the ones who reach C1 and C2 levels and sound thoughtful and precise and authoritative, they are the ones who never confuse the encouragement, which I'm giving you right now, with complacency. So truth one, stop waiting. Yes, if you are at an intermediate level already, your English is good enough to step forward. But truth two, once you step forward, keep pushing. Good enough is a starting point, not a destination. The 60% gets you in the conversation, gets you the opportunities. The 40% builds toward excellence. And you need both. You need them simultaneously for as long as you want to keep growing. If you want a structured environment to practice both, the B2 Edge app is where I'd send you. Real conversational pressure to build the courage, precise feedback to sharpen the accuracy, both together. So, link is in the description. And here's what I want you to do this week. Think of one thing you've been putting off because your English didn't feel ready. One thing. Maybe a message you haven't sent, an application you haven't submitted, a conversation you've been avoiding. Do it. Just do it. Not when your English is better. This week. Today. And when it's over, don't just feel relieved. Ask yourself, what worked? What didn't? What's one thing I can be more precise about next time? That's the 60-40. Courage in the doing, growth in the reflection. I'm Thiago. Thanks for hanging out with me today. And if you want to keep learning more, I highly recommend you check out this video next. I'll see you in the next one.